What makes the entire world tremble under U.S. sanctions, but leaves China standing firm? For nearly a century, the United States has ruled the world not just with soldiers or aircraft carriers, but with something far more subtle: money. The most powerful weapon America ever built isn't nuclear, and it doesn't explode. It's the U.S. dollar. For decades, the dollar hasn't only been a currency, it has been the operating system of global trade. Every country, from Germany to Ghana, needs dollars to buy oil, food, or technology. Every major bank, from London to Tokyo, clears its transactions through SWIFT, a global payment network that ultimately runs through servers in the United States. That means when Washington decides a country has crossed the line, it doesn't need to send troops. It simply cuts that country off from the dollar, from SWIFT, from the system. The results are immediate. When Russia invaded Crimea, the ruble lost half of its value within weeks. Iran's economy was paralyzed by banking bans. Cuba was isolated for more than half a century. To the rest of the world, America's message was crystal clear. If you play by our rules, you can trade. If you don't, you disappear. It's financial warfare, executed with a single keystroke, and for a long time, no one could resist it. But there's one country that refused to play by those rules. One nation that quietly spent 3 decades building an alternative system, woven so deeply into the global economy that cutting it off would mean cutting off the world itself. That country is China. While most nations stayed dependent on a US-centered financial system, China began. Since the 1990s, Beijing understood one simple truth: to survive in a world controlled by dollars, you move. And that's exactly. First, see physical supply chains of the MO. Look around your room, your pal man-made. China isn't just the world's factory. It's the central hub of nearly every industry on Earth, from rare earth minerals for batteries and semiconductors to almost everything pay. If the U.S. sanctions China, it's not just because sanction. Second, count. While most countries rely on the SWIFT payment network controlled by the U.S., base EPS, yuan, not doll. China has also stockpiled over to it and has been to trade. Bit by bit, Beijing is carving out a world where Washington. Third, China's. Unlike Iran or Cuba, China has 1.4 billion a midi. If global trade stopped tomorrow, factories could keep running just to serve domestic demand. The econ. China has diversified risk in a way no other nation ever has. They cease. Oh, that's why America's most powerful weapon, the dollar, barely makes. Because China didn't just prepare to survive U.S. sanctions, they built in. For decades, the global economy has revolved around a strange loop. Countries export goods to America to earn U.S. dollars. But then, with those same dollars, they turn around and buy from China. Machines, tools, fertilizer, cheap electronics, everything that keeps farms and factories alive comes from China. A farmer in Africa wants to grow more crops. He buys tractors, irrigation pumps, and fertilizer, all made in China. A manufacturer in South America needs to expand. They buy industrial machines, sensors, and spare parts, again from China. A company in Europe wants to cut costs. They rely on Chinese materials, components, and assembly lines. The world's entire logistics backbone now runs through Beijing. At first, this system worked perfectly for the United States. America imported cheap goods from China, sold advanced technology back, and used the dollar to keep the system spinning. But slowly, China began to move up the ladder. No longer just the factory of the world, it became the supplier of the factories themselves. They don't just sell consumer goods anymore. They sell the machines that make consumer goods. If China stopped exporting fertilizer, farms across Africa and South Asia would face collapse. If China stopped selling industrial equipment, factories in Latin America would grind to a halt. If China cut off electronic components, production lines from Mexico to Poland would fall silent. In a matter of months, the global supply chain would freeze. And Beijing knows this. They don't need to threaten anyone. They don't need to fire a single shot. Just by standing still, they remind the world how dependent it has become. Because in today's economy, it's not oil or weapons that keep nations alive. It's China's production line. But the most interesting part is what China started doing with all the US dollars it earned. Because instead of buying American debt, they began buying the world. For years, China played its part in America's grand financial loop. It sold goods to the world, earned US dollars, and then sent those dollars right back to Washington, buying US Treasury bonds and investing in American tech companies. It was the perfect symbiosis. China supplied goods, America supplied money, and the system, known as the petrodollar, kept the global economy running smoothly. But after the 2008 financial crisis, Beijing began to notice something unsettling. Holding US debt, they realized, means holding paper that Washington can devalue anytime it wants. China was lending money to America, and America was paying it back by printing more of it. So Beijing changed the game. Instead of buying more US debt, China began buying gold. Instead of leaving money in American banks, it began buying real assets, companies, technology, and land. Each shipment of goods that left a Chinese port brought back not just dollars, but power. The power to reshape the financial order itself, as thousands of tons of gold moved into China's vaults. Confidence in the US dollar started to waver. Central banks around the world began hedging, selling US bonds, buying gold, and holding more yuan. Gold prices surged, US bond yields rose. And for the first time in decades, Washington felt pressure from its own creation. Because every time China sold a slice of US debt, it wasn't just a financial move. It was a political message. We no longer need your paper. We have gold, we have goods, and we have the world's supply chain in our hands. The system America built to control others was now being used against it. And for the first time since the end of World War II, the dollar's throne no longer felt unshakable. So the US did what empires always do when their financial power starts to fade. They looked for a new battlefield, and this time, it wasn't money. It was technology. When financial pressure no longer worked, Washington turned to a new kind of weapon, technology. The idea was simple. If China couldn't access the world's most advanced chips, its rise as a tech superpower would stall. So the US government began tightening the screws, chip bans, export controls. Allies like Japan, the Netherlands, and South Korea were pressured to stop selling chip-making equipment to China. American giants like Nvidia, AMD, and Intel were forced to cut off their Chinese clients, even though China accounted for a huge share of their global revenue. On paper, it looked like a strategic masterpiece. If China couldn't buy advanced chips, it couldn't build cutting-edge AI, couldn't compete in quantum computing, couldn't challenge Silicon Valley. But in reality, the plan backfired. China didn't retreat. It retaliated. Beijing poured billions into its own semiconductor research, rallied state-owned enterprises, and unleashed tens of thousands of engineers with one goal. If we can't buy it, we'll build it. Within just a few years, China rolled out its first 7-nanometer chips. Not the most advanced, but powerful enough to train AI models and drive domestic innovation. Every new restriction only accelerated China's determination. The more Washington tried to contain it, the faster Beijing learned to live without it. At the same time, the bans began hurting the very companies they were meant to protect. Nvidia lost billions in potential sales. Intel's margins shrank. Chip equipment makers saw orders dry up. The US had fired its technological weapon and hit its own industries in the process. By trying to isolate China, America began isolating itself from one of the world's biggest markets. The result? 2 separate tech ecosystems, one led by Washington and one rising from Beijing. And for the first time in modern history, the world's technology supply chain was being split in two. But this battle isn't really about chips or AI anymore. It's about 2 different systems competing to define the future. One built on money, the other on production. And together they've set the stage for the most important economic showdown of the century. At this point, the conflict between the United States and China was no longer about trade or technology. It had become something far deeper, a battle between two systems and two visions of how the world should work. America's power is built on faith in the dollar, a system where every country must use U.S. currency to trade, and where Washington can print more of it whenever it needs to. Money, credit, and consumption. That's the engine of the American-led world. China's system is the opposite. It's built on production. Real factories, real goods, real labor. If America rules with the printing press, China rules with the assembly line. When the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, China counters with the supply chain. When Washington freezes bank accounts, Beijing holds back containers. One dominates through finance, the other through materials. Together they've locked the world into a fragile equilibrium. One side printing wealth, the other side producing it. For smaller nations caught in between, this clash feels like gravity pulling in two directions. Follow America, and you gain access to capital, investment, and technology, but risk losing control over your currency. Follow China, and you gain factories, infrastructure, and cheap goods, but risk becoming dependent on its production web. Neither path is truly free. Each one comes with invisible chains. This isn't a Cold War fought with bombs. It's a silent one, fought with data, energy, and logistics. No explosions, no soldiers, just balance sheets, trade routes, and server cables, deciding who commands the 21st century. And in that silence, a question echoes across the global system. If the dollar is no longer at the center of the world, then what will be? The world is standing at a strange crossroads in history. For nearly a century, the US dollar has ruled as the heartbeat of the global economy. But now, for the first time, that pulse is beginning to change. Not through war, not through revolution, but through production, technology, and trust. China isn't trying to destroy the old system. It's trying to rewrite it in its own language. A system where power doesn't come from printing money, but from making things the world can't live without. Steel, energy, food, microchips, infrastructure, these are the new currencies of power. And maybe that's the real lesson of the 21st century. It's not about who has the most money, but who controls what money can't buy. When a country can build, grow, and feed itself, it doesn't just survive global sanctions, it becomes immune to them. As America keeps defending the old order with dollars and sanctions, and China builds a new one through goods and industry, the rest of the world, nations like ours, must learn to balance between two tides of power. Because for the first time in modern history, there isn't just one empire. There are two, and both believe the future belongs to them. One rules through finance, the other rules through production, and the battle between them will decide the fate of the global system. Pause. Nyakhadan. The age of bombs and armies is ending. The age of money, data, and supply chains has begun. A new era of power has already started.